Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orland Johnson. Let me introduce you to our guest panelists for today. First, we have Dr. Andrew Polk, who's an associate professor of history at Middle Tennessee State University and the author of the critically acclaimed book, Faith and Freedom: Propaganda, Presidential Politics, and the Making of an American Religion. We also have with us Ms. Melissa Reed, who's the Director of Government Affairs for the North American Division of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have with us Ms. Bettina Krause, the editor of Liberty Magazine, and we also have with us Ms. Jennifer Woods, who's the General Counsel and Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for the Lake Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Great to have you guys here with us and really looking forward to our conversation for today. You know, recently there was a passing of one I would call one of the probably biggest political figures who I think is a representative of faith and politics. And I'm talking about the 39th President of the United States, Jimmy Carter. He was an individual who was known as being a farmer. He was an engineer. He was a businessman, a planner, a scientist, a governor, and last but very not least, he was a Christian. You know, Carter was one of those individuals who always introduced himself as being the average man. There are a lot of people who would say that his political career from the presidential standpoint was not one that was stellar, and many people to some degree may have even viewed him as being someone who was a failed president and had a failed presidency. But the fact of the matter is I think first and foremost when you think about Carter, you know that he was president of the United States, but secondly, and a very close second, that Carter was a man of faith who was committed to a vision for his nation and somehow, in my opinion, figured out to find the right balance of faith and politics. An individual who basically started the Department of Education. He was an individual who helped Habitat for the Humanity to go to the next level. You know, at the end of the day, when I think about a lot of the things that people will think about Jimmy Carter, some will think about Vietnam, some will think about Watergate, some will think about the hostages in Iran, but I will always think about him as being an individual who thought it was more important to be a good person and Christ-like in all that he did. You know, Andy, when I think about Jimmy Carter and some of the things that he did and what he's recognized for, and probably someone who spent 100 years of life and got every ounce out of it. He's one of those individuals that I'm just curious to know what your thoughts are and maybe what you may have thought of a Carter that may even never even crossed my mind.
Yeah, I think President Carter's legacy is long and diverse, which isn't necessarily true of all former presidents. He's generally considered a failure as a president, right? A one-term president, and yet perhaps the most successful post-president there's ever been. I'm not sure that's totally fair to his record, but I think his legacy and what we're talking about is twofold for this. Exactly what you said, Orland, of one, he very clearly articulated his values in terms of, if I'm president, it is not about power, it's not about prestige, it's not even necessarily about my lasting influence, but it's explicitly about character, right? I am here, I have responsibility to help, to take care of people, and that's how it works. And if we start from that standpoint, then that is telling in not only how we get things done, but what we can possibly get done. Now, the side of this that was notorious was he went on air and told the American people, we are having financial problems and I'm going to do the best I can, but you need to stop spending money you don't have. You need to be responsible. We are all in this together. Everything he was saying was right. It was terrible politically for him. And he knew that to some degree, but he thought that was the responsible thing. But there's also a way of the way he went about politics, right? When Roe v. Wade comes out, he's generally, because of his personal faith, against abortion, except possibly in the case of rape, incest, or the medical necessity. And yet his response to that was not to bash it, not to demonize everyone who is against. He simply said, okay, well, why are women in the U.S. getting abortions? And he found a lot of this was economic. And so he started programs championed bills to give greater assistance to mothers, to children, essentially started the ability for a seamless adoption program in the U.S. To him, the ways that we help people are within the law, but the people take paramount. And I think if nothing else, that's the legacy that we should remember and hopefully start demanding more from our politicians.
Wow.
And what Andy is describing here, Orlin, it seems to me, is the very model of how a person of faith can bring their faith into the public realm, into an elected role in a way that is productive and not destructive. I mean, clearly, as Andy has said, President Carter's faith was who he was. It informed his values, it informed his priorities, his worldview, his perspective on life, and that clearly shaped his presidential policies and approach. But that's very different indeed than a Christian nationalist approach to bringing your faith into the public realm. It's using your faith in a way that reflects your values rather than trying to use the law in a coercive way for religious ends. And, I think this has a lot to do with his Baptist roots.
Yeah.
Because he held very closely to that historical Baptist understanding of church-state relations.
Yep.
He saw separation of church and state not as something that was unfriendly to religion. He saw it as something that helped ensure that everyone had religious freedom rights, not just majority Christianity. So he ended the practice of inviting Billy Graham and other religious leaders to the White House. When he was asked about school prayer and those Supreme Court controversial cases, he said, prayer is a personal thing.
Yeah.
We don't need to have state-sponsored prayer in schools. So, that for me is what I take from his legacy, his role as balancing this faith and politics in an elected position.
Orlin, I agree with Bettina as far as, in my mind, he really is a model of what a person of faith should look like, how they should engage in a public service. And even just the fact that he was a public servant, right? That he was inspired. He saw this as something that he, as a Christian, was called to do, was to serve others, to serve the broader community. And I think it's so interesting. I was reading a retrospective on him, and it was, of course, he ran for president in 1976, and at the time announced himself as a born-again evangelical Christian. That was at a time where, first of all, a lot of people just had to scramble, at least journalists had to scramble to even identify what a born-again evangelical was. It was not something that he did in order to gain votes. It was something that he did in order so that people would know better who he was and what he was motivated by. And, Andy mentioned his stances that were maybe not what, again, looking at this from a 21st century perspective, not consistent with the traditional Christian understanding as far as, various social policies, whether it's, women's reproductive rights or LGBTQ rights, both of those things. And again, I think that helped illustrate that it was something that he was inspired by, rather than, as Bettina pointed out, not something that he wanted to enforce or mandate in the broader public square. So I really feel like this is the model of who a person of faith, how they should conduct themselves in a public service role.
Yeah, when I think of President Carter, I think servant leader, really. I think he really bore his faith in his day-to-day, right? His humanitarian work, his work with the Carter Foundation, his work uplifting the poorest and the least of these. And, I think that we often, we look at, he was only a one-term president, but you look at all that he did after, right? Like his Christianity was a constant. And I think that it's something that could be a model for people, the servant leadership that he exhibited.
You know, the interesting thing when you think about Carter and some of the things that he got accomplished, and there are a lot of things that got accomplished during his presidency that just kind of gets backhanded. You know, even the negotiation of the hostages coming home was something that he had really worked on prior to the next administration coming in. But the thing that I find that I'm wondering is very rarely do you see someone who uses political power to really make sure that you're helping somebody else. You know, he kind of operated from this adage that all of my decisions I'm going to make, I don't care if they're politically bad for me, but I think that they're actually good for the people who I'm here to represent. And, you know, Bettina, that was the thing that kind of struck me about, it's not common that U.S. politics garners power and doesn't even take a little bit of it for themselves. And Carter almost seemed like he wouldn't even take a little bit of it for himself.
You know, it's so interesting because that is actually closer to the original conception of how political power would be used in the American Republic. I mean, that was how the founders actually anticipated or hoped that power would be used, because they didn't have an understanding that we would, fracture into these political parties. They thought that a political leader would actually come into office and actually do things for the common good rather than for the good of their party. But that very quickly fell apart, of course. But we could do with a whole lot more. Part of what Jimmy Carter did also was, I think we should remember, is not just work for the good of the American people. He was really focused on making a difference in the international community.
Yes.
And the way he ran his State Department was very much focused on advancing core American values, such as religious freedom, such as freedom of speech and political association, around the world. He saw America as a beacon, as a nation that could do good in the world. And, that's a really refreshing attitude. I think that's his example is one that we could do with a lot more in our current political era.
Orlin, I was just thinking about his work. We talked about the international component and really how he dedicated service to eradicating the guinea worm, right? And was successful in that. And again, I see both the heart of service, that servant leadership, but also the humility there, because this was not like a sexy sort of problem to solve, right? Or a trendy problem to solve, but it was one that he recognized was dire to that community, right? But also solvable, and dedicated time to doing that. So I think that really speaks to his legacy as well.
I'm going to let that be the last word. But, one of the things that we can constantly say is that, from a Christian perspective, or generally from a religious perspective, we're all called upon to look out for those who are less fortunate and to actually see it exemplified in the chief executive of a particular nation on a full-time basis was something that I'm not sure that we'll ever see again. But then again, I think Jimmy Carter was a very unique individual, and I'm not sure we're supposed to ever see it again. There's so many cases that are actually coming up on a regular basis that have to do with activities in schools, activities in universities, issues going on in terms of, chaplains, the Ten Commandments. And there's an interesting case, it's called Jordan Cernek versus the Argyle School District, in which we have a Wisconsin teacher who is suing his school district for allegedly firing him for refusing to use a student's preferred pronouns. This was a complaint that's been filed in the courts in Wisconsin, and it's actually one of those issues where an individual, ironically, who's an English teacher, has objected to the school district telling him that he should be, quote unquote, referring to transgender students by their preferred pronouns. For religious reasons, he said, that's something I just cannot do. The district officially allegedly permitted him to be exempt from the rule after two transgender students asked him to refer to them by their preferred names, and the accommodation was rescinded 2 months later. As a result thereof, as with everything, when people disagree, we find ourselves in court. So we've got a situation where an English teacher is being told that your failure to use pronouns in a certain way is a problem because of the political aspect of it, because of the social aspect of it. And this individual is claiming, well, from a religious standpoint, I have some issues. Jennifer, when I see a case like this, one of the things I guess it does call you into question is, what happens within a 2-month period when this is okay and now it's not okay? But also what happens when somebody's saying, I don't want to do this for religious reasons, when you really aren't even sure if it's that, or is it politics, or is it something else, or is I just don't feel like doing it? How do we get to parse ourselves through all of this mess?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to work through. And, it's interesting because this isn't the only state where we're seeing this issue taking place with teachers and the use of pronouns. And in this particular case, I looked at some of the filings and I was reading some of the statements that his counsel made. And a statement that his attorney said was that there is a clash between respecting a student's gender identity preferences and the longstanding rights of people like Mr. Cernek, meaning religious rights as far as the use of pronouns. And I said, why is there this clash here, right? Is this a necessary clash? Because we've seen in other states where, and in other situations where people have been able to come to some sort of compromise where neither the students' rights nor the teachers' rights are being violated, right? We've seen instances where teachers have used last names or they found some other way to address students that's still respectful, and where the students don't feel like they're being, harmed, and the teacher feels like they're still being able to honor their view of the proper, how they view the proper use of names, right? And in this instance, when I looked through the facts, it seemed as if, at first that he's pointing at all the students instead of using names. And at first that was okay. And then he said, I'll use last names. And he was first told, sure. And then he was told, no, don't use last names. So I'm trying to figure out where's the middle ground here where both sides can be respected and honored. And because it seems like neither side's really willing to budge, this is why we're in court now. And it seems like other states, other places, other jurisdictions have found a way to figure this out. So it'll be interesting to see if Wisconsin gets there as well.
I agree with Jennifer as far as I'm really interested in what the outcome will be long term, because as she's pointing out, many other states have found ways to be respectful to both perspectives, both sides. And also, we're post-Groff with this conversation.
Right.
And we know that standard for religious accommodation has been restored to a higher standard. And so, it doesn't, again, in the reading that I did or the news stories that I saw, I didn't see a level of accommodation attempted for this gentleman as far as long term, right? I'm curious, like you were, Orlin, as far as what happened in those 2 months, right? That suddenly it was no longer, the school district was no longer able to accommodate the gentleman. And I think another point that we should often consider when we're having conversations about religious discrimination in the workplace is that is their own sincerely held belief, right? This individual's own sincerely. So whether or not it makes sense to me, that this gentleman refers, uses pronouns or preferred pronouns or isn't comfortable with that, and that said, is really honestly irrelevant. This is his sincerely held religious belief. I think that gets lost in sort of the culture war conversation as well.
Bettina, some of this culture war seems to be pressing in the direction of, I want you to acquiesce to what I want. I don't want an accommodation. I don't want a middle road. I want it my way or no other way. And it seems that if this is the attitude that even courts will take on in some form or fashion, I don't know how you ever get to a word called compromise ever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my way or the highway, right? And we are seeing that driving the cases that are emerging through both the state and federal courts at present. But I think we're also seeing clues, Orlin, as to the way that the courts are going to be deciding this. I mean, the Seventh Circuit a couple of years back held in favor of a school teacher. In a similar situation, the same year, Supreme Court of Virginia held the same in favor of a French teacher at a public school. Sixth Circuit, exactly the same. We've already seen clues how the Supreme Court is going to deal with any sort of case that deals with compelled speech, the 303 creative case a couple of years back. I think that it's pretty clear to me legally where this is going. But I think you're right. We have an attempt to drive a narrative. That's what I think many of these cases are about. And it's an attempt to fan the flames of polarization on this issue. I don't know how we get around that. I think we're just going to have to wait and see as it works through the courts. And hopefully we can do what we can to create a more balanced, less polarized conversation around these things.
Andy, do you see a lot of that going on, for example, in an institution like yours where you're a faculty member, you have to interact with students in so many different ways, office hours in the classroom? Is this becoming a focal point on a regular basis now?
It is increasingly, for all the reasons that my co-panelists said, right? There's an increasing, your question before, right? How do we get to compromise? I think compromise is not the thing that we're looking for, right? Compromise is capitulation, oftentimes. And in this case, as in many of these cases, the human beings just get washed out and it becomes symbols of what we have, right? So as Melissa said, right, my personal opinion would be, I'm not sure there's anything that I can do for another human being that is easier than substitute one word for another word. I don't think there's anything less than that. I can do that. And yet this teacher said explicitly, and all of the evidence says this is true, that he tried to. I did everything in my power to accommodate the needs of my students without compromising my faith. I don't know how we get better than that, right? I mean, isn't that all we're trying to do? He cares about the students. He's trying to find a way. It's a difficult balance. But the difficulty is now balance and compromise are anathema. They're not what we're after. That is capitulation. That's losing. So we win at all costs, sometimes including giving up the people that we're supposedly fighting for. I'm not sure we're necessarily fighting for people. Again, we're fighting for ideas and being right.
Andrew, I agree. I think that today we think of the word compromise as giving up, right? It's not seen as a positive. It's seen as a negative. And it's like, well, why did you give anything, right? Why don't just hold your ground? And the statement that he made, as far as he tried to accommodate to the extent that he could without compromising his faith, it shows where we're supposed to go. We're supposed to do what we can do without compromising our beliefs and our faith. And, like you said, what more can we ask of someone than that?
Well, Melissa, I grew up as the son of a school teacher, and I find it almost impossible for me to figure out how would I be talking with somebody where I'm even using a pronoun. I mean, I would almost have to refigure out English and all the aspects of English that I learned in first grade to even try to purposefully make this happen. When I sit down and think about it, so part of it kind of becomes, okay, am I looking for a complete change? It has to be a new nomenclature regarding how I speak to people, even in a way that may be contrary to all the laws of English that some of us have been, learning since we were a child.
Yeah, and I think all of us hold in very high esteem those educators in our community, right? And all of the various challenges. This is very, very, in my opinion, low on the list of the challenges that our educators have to deal with. And it's disappointing, I guess, that it's gotten to this level, or, as far as adjudication and things like that we've lost that humanity, that humanness involved in both the perspective of the student and the perspective of the educator, and not being able to find any sort of, and I'll use the word compromise. I was smiling when Jennifer was talking because I'm thinking about the work that I do on Capitol Hill, and compromise is a bad word. We do, lawmakers do not admit that you compromised on anything, And so again, that's also why we don't see a lot of, productivity on Capitol Hill these days, particularly when there was a split legislature. But yeah, I I think we've lost the plot a little bit as far as, or the priority as far as, caring for individuals, recognizing their humanity, and then recognizing the just absolute dire need for educating our young people, and that being the priority rather than, some sort of culture war battle.
No, Bettina, you and I have kind of had this conversation before where I tell you about the trust that I have for the American people. And I truly believe that when major issues come that are catastrophic, that trouble them in a great way, they swing very hard in the other direction. And I'm wondering if some of this activity may create an event one day that may cause that heavy swing. And that's where I could kind of see some of this stuff going.
We have had this conversation, Orlin, and your optimism is touching. But actually, joking aside, I do think you're correct. We, in all these cultural shifts, we see these huge pendulum swings. And in a way, the pendulum has to swing. The extreme positions have to be aired, have to be stated. And hopefully we come to that moderate, medium position that accommodates the dignity of everyone involved.
I just hope one day we can get to the point where I can make the statement, I did everything possible to accommodate you, and people will say thank you, and it would come to an end. And that's where I hope we can get as a society. Hey, Andy, tell me something I don't know.
Orlin, did you know in the early days of the modern Olympic Games, right, for over 30 years, we didn't just have athletic contests, but we also had contests in the liberal arts, in literature, in architecture, in painting. If in the last Olympics we can do breakdancing, I think in the next one we can have a poetry slam.
Bettina, tell me something I don't know.
Okay, I'm going to shock you here, Orlin. Did you know that giraffes are 30 times more likely to get hit by lightning than people? And don't ask me how they know that.
Jennifer, tell me something I don't know.
Sure. So we were talking about President Carter earlier and his heart to help the least of these. Did you know that he was the first president to live in public housing?
Did not know that. Melissa, tell me something I don't know.
All right. So, Orlin, the Department of Education has been a part of our conversation, our national conversation recently. Did you know that cabinet level position was actually established by President Jimmy Carter back in 1980?
Wow, unbelievable. Listen, great conversation today. Looking forward to doing this again soon. And thank you again for being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.